So today I want to talk about parents and the impact that parents have on our beliefs, our self-image, how we feel about ourselves, our confidence, and who we are, who we think we are. So whether we want to admit it or not, our parents have a huge influence over us and how they shape us. And that also means they have a huge influence on how we feel about ourselves. Whether we feel good about ourselves or not. So I'm going to tell you about my father and what it was like for me growing up without a father and how that influenced me and how I overcame the feeling of limitation and feeling of not being loved. So my father was an alcoholic, and he basically looked like a bum on the street. And he smelled like one. And the worst story I heard about him was that he drank 2 bottles of rubbing alcohol once because he was just jonesing for booze so badly. Another story was that he couldn't pour his own whiskey into a glass because his hand was shaking too much. So he had to call my mom, who was dealing with a baby at the time, to come and pour his booze for him. So this guy was a hardcore alcoholic. And he died at the age of 55, and he lived, mostly like off the government and in a, shitty hotel downtown. But as a kid, I was growing up, I didn't know all of this. So, I'm 5, 6 years old and I just want to see my dad. So I'm crying, I want my daddy every night before bed. So my mom finally said, okay, we'll put together a meeting and we'll go meet at Grandpa's house. So I get to the house, I go in, and as soon as I walk in the door, I can smell the smell of old booze. Like, it was bad. And I hear his voice to the left. Hey, boy. Hey, give me a hug. I was like, what the hell? So I give the guy a hug and we stand and talk for about 5 minutes, and, I'm done. I'm like, I had enough of that. And, we left. And after that, I never cried anymore. I never said, I want to see my dad. I want to see my dad. And, I also judged him. He wasn't what I had in my mind. I wanted someone to like teach me things and to play catch with me and to, spend time with me and try to like build me up. So I went on, never just trying to, go on and be a kid. But there was still a void in my perception. There was still something missing in my perception. And that showed up in, various ways, lack of confidence. And later, when I was, 18, 19 years old, becoming really needy when it came to relationships and just having a general lack of belief in myself. And I knew that there was some baggage there around not having a father. And when I was 33, then my first son, was 1 year old. So I was like, okay. And I'd been reading tons of, self-help and personal development books. And, I understood all the basics, right? And then I was reading this book called The Breakthrough Experience, and it was by Dr. Demartini. And in the book, there is a chapter on doing the DeMartini method. And throughout the book, he's talking it up as he created this method. It's super powerful. You do it on a person. And I was like, okay, well, if I'm ever going to do this, it'll be on my dad. Because, you do it on someone where you have an emotional charge. But I procrastinated for about a year, putting it off. And when my son turned 1, I was like, okay, he's starting to develop a personality. He's going to pick up on my subconscious baggage, and I'm going to end up projecting that on him. So let's get down to business and do this work. So time to face the demons, right? Time to go through some pain and face those parts that, we don't really want to look at. We want to just stuff them down and hope they don't affect us somehow, but they always do. They always find a way of emerging and, showing up in our lives in some way. So I sat down and I got the book out, and, I only met my dad 3 times. Once when I was 6 years old, another time when I was 16 years old, and he showed up at the house on my birthday, drunk, and he gave me money. He hugged my friend who he thought was me, and then he left. And, that was one of the worst memories I've had of him. And then the last time I saw him, I was downtown and I was going to go meet up with some friends, and he was there, and I couldn't walk past anywhere else. So I had to walk past him, and he just says, hey, boy, I got a smoke. And I just looked him in the eyes and shook my head, and I was like, doesn't even recognize his own son. And then I just kept walking. And that was the last time I saw him before he died. He died at about the age of 55. So I never felt any love from him. And I like to pretend, or like to think, I really believed, I was indifferent about the situation. And I've talked to other people about this too, and their parents who are estranged, and they think that they're indifferent, or they thought they were indifferent, until I said, well, what if that person just walked in the room right now? Would you still feel neutral around them? Would you still feel okay with that? And they're like, no. Well, that means you still got an emotional charge around that person. So there's still something that needs to get dealt with. So I knew there was stuff that I needed to work on, internal work, do the internal work, right? So I sat down and I started doing the DeMartini method. And the first thing you do is you identify the traits that this person has. And, well, I judged him as inconsiderate for showing up on my birthday drunk. I judged him as lazy for not working, not providing any money for my mom, who basically raised us 3 kids while she was on welfare. And I judged him as selfish for just spending his life drinking. So those were the traits that I perceived in him. And, you go through and you ask specific questions. And these are very counterintuitive. They're very targeted. Each question is based on a universal principle. And they're very counterintuitive. They're not things that we would think of normally. And so I'm going through the process. And I'm trying, because, you have to dig. These questions don't come easy. If you're going to have a huge breakthrough, you probably would have already had it already. So these questions cause you to ask, or to think differently, to think in ways that, we don't naturally do. So I'm digging. I'm like, one of the toughest questions was, who perceived him displaying and demonstrating the opposite traits. All right, who perceived him doing the opposite traits? How the hell am I supposed to know that? My brain just wanted to say no, there was nobody, right? But you can't give up. So, this was for my son. This is for my family. I wanted to get this worked out. So I kept thinking, who could have seen him do the opposite? Like unselfish, caring, considerate, and I'm like, maybe my mom when I was a baby, like my sister, and I'd only met him 3 times, and it couldn't have been longer than 20 minutes or half an hour in time total. But one of the other principles, since I've, learned this method and became trained in this method, was that if you have had an experience with someone long enough to create an emotional charge, then you also have enough information subconsciously to remove that charge. So I kept digging, I kept searching, who's seen the opposite? Who's seen the opposite in him? My sister, my brother, my mom, I don't know, running through my mind. And then suddenly this picture came to my mind. Looking from the sky down on him while he was walking toward our house on my 16th birthday. He had a limp. He had polio as a child, so he had a withered leg. And I could see him in my mind hiking his sorry ass to my house from the bus stop, coming to see me. And then I realized that I had seen him do the opposite. He remembered my birthday. And he found out where I lived. And he was basically crippled, somewhat crippled. And he took his self all the way across town to where I lived on the bus and came to see me. And he gave me $100 and my brother some money too, of the little money that he gets from the government. He had to face my mom, who he hadn't seen in a decade at least. So of course he was probably terrified, and he drank. And that took some balls. That took some effort. So he was considerate enough to remember my birthday. He was hardworking enough to make it there in the afternoon. And he was unselfish enough to give me some of his money that he had. And when I realized that, I felt love in my heart. Like my heart opened up. My heart cracked open. Like I could feel it in my chest. And I got tears in my eyes. And that was the first time I'd ever felt love from my father. And it was beautiful. It was beautiful. It was a beautiful feeling. And it changed the way I felt about myself. So the way we perceive our parents changes how we feel about ourselves. So I felt more worthy of love. And it was huge. I knew that was it. I knew I'd overcome that baggage. And this was all just from a book, The Breakthrough Experience by Dr. Demartini. So I really wanted to understand what the heck just happened here, because I'd read tons of books before on self-help and personal development, and I'd never had anything like that happen before. That took about 10 minutes. And I was like, I need to learn more about this. So I went down that rabbit hole and basically learned about the universal principles, learned about how our awareness is basically limited and biased. And anytime we have limitation and bias, we are going to feel pain, or we're going to feel like something's missing. And so I got trained in the DeMartini method, and I've worked with him a couple of times in his seminars, and I got really good at this method and started coaching people using it. And I've seen some amazing transformations and some amazing insights, heart-opening moments since then. But the fact that, going back to the parents, the fact that our parents are shaping us in this way is really important to understand. I was camping, and people were staying up quite late, and I could hear, these were pretty, people in their 20s, 30s. I could hear what the people at the tent were talking, different tents, various tents were talking about. These were the kind of long nights where people stayed up till 4 a.m. talking. And they were talking about their parents, They were talking about their parents and different various tents. Like I was really surprised, like how many people were talking about their parents. So now there's another part of this where I thought I didn't have a dad, growing up. That was my limited perception. And that caused some grief for me. So later, 10 years later or something, I started to go through, I learned the principle that nothing is missing. Nothing is ever missing in this world. So I had to go through, what did I want from a father? And, I wanted him to teach me things. I wanted him to play catch with me. It was so important for me to have someone to play catch with. I wanted someone to encourage me. And I felt like that was missing. So I sat down and did the work again. Who was in my life that showed up as a father figure? And this, instead of receiving a father in the form of one person, I received it in the form of many. So my friends' fathers would take me and their family on camping trips. They would take me, and we'd go places, and we'd go places. They'd take me camping, they'd take me hiking, and it was like I was a part of their family. I was adopted, almost, in a way. And that was around the age of grade 4. In grade 6, my mom had a boyfriend who taught me martial arts, and he showed me that I could learn and that I could develop skills and get really good at them. Learning how to do roundhouse kicks and spin kicks and all kinds of interesting martial arts, kung fu style. So he taught me things. And I had, in grade 7, my friend's dad, he played catch with us all the time. He played football, baseball, whatever it was. We'd play sports all the time together. And in grade 7, I had a teacher, and, I was screwing around too much in grade 7, and he took me out to the hallway and told me that if I don't get my shit together, I'm going to amount to nothing. And it was some hard truth to hear, the same hard truth that you would hear from a father who's trying to help his son. So that was some tough love. And then later, my mom's other boyfriend, the one who became my stepfather, they got married later. In my 20s, he taught me about the world. He taught me about life, how the world works. And he was kind of like my first personal development coach, where he would stand there and lecture me for 3 hours, sounding like he was really pissed off, but actually he was just passing down what he'd learned. And I took all that in, and it was really life-changing to hear that. So I did not have a father in the form of one. I had a father in the form of many. And if I had only had my specific father in my life, I wouldn't have learned all of those other things from him. He couldn't have taught me martial arts. He couldn't have played football and baseball with me. You know, he probably would have taught me a lot of bad habits, a lot of negative beliefs, a lot of limiting beliefs, rather than showing me the opposite. So I really benefited from having multiple fathers. And when you start to see this awareness, when you start to understand this, you know, you feel not only loved by all of those people, but you feel loved by the universe. You feel loved by God or the grand design of this place that we live in. And the only reason we didn't see it before was because we just didn't have the perspective. We just didn't have the awareness of all of those people. You know, they were all just kind of buried in my subconscious. So the love was always there. You know, the men in my life who acted as fathers were always there. You know, the fact that my dad showed up on my birthday and was hardworking and considerate was always there, but I just wasn't able to see it. And that's why coaching, and that's why this discovery is so important, to be able to raise your awareness and to be able to see more than what's immediately apparent, to dig deeper. And that's what I'm here to share with people. That's what I love doing. That's what I have worked on for the last 5-10 years on getting really good at, and helping people to have this insight, these really deep, heart-opening insights. So I've created a school community, skool.com. And in that community, I put on Zoom meetings where we work on our limiting beliefs. We do this kind of work together. And I coach people through the process. And it's not easy. Like, you got to face some shit, right? And you got to talk about some shit, and you got to feel some feelings. But by the time you get through it, you're going to feel a lot better. You're going to feel a lot lighter, and you're going to be much more free. And you'll have more confidence, you'll feel more love, and you'll see things from a much higher perspective. So, yeah, that's about it. So if you're interested in growing, if you're interested in learning how to do this, then you can find me on School. You can look up my name, Doug Spence, and yeah, I'll be there. Shoot me a message, say hello. Yeah, that's about it. All right, guys. Talk to you later.